A Chocolate Chip Cookie Murder. Chapter 15. Part 1. Hannah stepped back to assess her reflection. Her new dress was exquisite. She'd pulled her frizzy red hair back in the ebony clasp her younger sister Michelle had sent from an art and jewelry fair they'd held on the McAllister campus, and it actually looked good. And Lisa had been right. Her new shoes couldn't have been more perfect. Hannah looked sophisticated for the first time in her life, and it was a bit of a shock. She also looked sexy, which was even more of a shock, and she hoped that Norman wouldn't think she'd worn this dress just for him. Moish yowled from his spot on the bed, and Hannah turned to give him a thumbs up. "You're right. I know I've never looked this good before. It's a real change, isn't it?" Moish yowled again, and Hannah assumed that it was a change he didn't appreciate. He also knew that she was going out again, and he didn't appreciate that either. She dabbed on a bit of perfume from the bottle of Chanel No. 5 that her old college roommate had given her years before, and headed off to the kitchen to appease the beast that lived under her roof. Several kitty treats later, and Moish was happy again. Hannah paced across the floor waiting for Norman. She didn't dare sit down. Her new dress was black, and every chair in her apartment was inundated with orange cat hair. She was just crossing the living room for the 16th time when her doorbell rang. "Stay." Hannah used the command voice the dog trainers on television used, and Moish looked startled. It probably didn't work on cats, but there was really no danger of Moish escaping when she opened the door. He had a full food bowl, and he knew when he had a good thing going. "Hi, Hannah." Norman sounded a little nervous as he thrust out a fluorescent box. These are for you." Hannah smiled and ushered him in. To her surprise, Norman looked much better in his formal clothing than she thought he would. "Thanks, Norman. Just let me get my coat and I'll be ready to go." "You'd better put those in water first." Norman gestured toward the box. "My mother wanted me to get you a corsage, but I told her that this wasn't a prom date." Hannah laughed and led the way to the kitchen to get out a vase. She filled it with water, opened the box, and smiled as she took out a large bunch of pink, white, and yellow daisies. "Thank you, Norman. They're beautiful, and I like them much better than a corsage." "You didn't tell me you had a cat." Norman stared at Moish, who had lifted his head from the depths of his food dish to examine the stranger who had invaded his kitchen. Hannah quickly thrust the flowers in the vase and turned to Norman in alarm. "Sorry, I didn't think to tell you. You're not allergic, are you?" "Not at all. Cats are some of my favorite people. What's his name?" "Moish." "After Moish Dayan?" "That's right. He's blind in one eye." "Perfect name." Norman bent down and extended his hand. "Come here and meet me, big guy." Hannah watched in amazement as Moish padded over to Norman and rubbed up against his hand. Her cat had never been this sociable before. Norman scratched him under the chin, and she could hear Moish purr all the way across the kitchen. "He likes you." "I guess he does." Hannah watched as Norman scooped Moish up and tickled his belly, something Moish usually hated. But her cat just lulled in Norman's arms and looked as blissful as a cat could look. "Okay, Moish, we have to go." Norman carried him out to the living room and set him down on the couch. "Do you leave the television on for him?" Hannah nodded, hoping Norman wouldn't think she was crazy. "It's company for him when I'm gone." "That makes sense. I'll do it while you get your coat. Which channel does he like?" "Anything except Animal Planet. They run wet programs and he hates wets." Hannah went to the closet and grabbed the coat she'd chosen, a previously owned cashmere that she'd found at Helping Hands. When she came back into the living room, Norman was frowning. "Is there something wrong, Norman?" "I was just kicking myself for forgetting to tell you how gorgeous you look. I should have said that right away. Mother would have a fit if she knew." Hannah laughed. "So would my mother." Dolores made me promise to tell you how nice you looked, and I forgot. If we run into them at the party, we won't mention it. How's that?" "Good." Norman opened the door and waited for Hannah to step through. Hannah?" "Yes, Norman." Hannah double-locked the door with her key, and they walked down the stairs to the ground floor. "We're going to run into them at the party. As a matter of fact, we'll see them before that." Hannah winced. "Don't tell me we're picking them up." "Not exactly. I did that already. Before I came to get you, they're both waiting for us in the back seat of my car." Hannah felt as if she were stuck in a time warp as they drove to the Woodleys' mansion. It was a lot like being a kid again, dragged off to a party by her mother. To make matters worse, Norman's mother had brought a camera, and she'd blithely announced that she planned to take pictures of them. Hannah had feared that this evening might turn out to be an ordeal, but it was going to be even worse than she'd anticipated. The Woodley mansion was ablaze with lights, and when they pulled up, a red-jacketed valet came forward to take Norman's car. Another parking attendant opened the doors, and Hannah and their mothers were assisted out of the car and up to the front entrance. Hannah gazed around her as she entered the foyer on Norman's arm. It had been decorated for the occasion with banks upon banks of tropical blooms. Of course they were imported. Birds of paradise, royal poinciana, and Chinese hibiscus didn't grow in Minnesota even in the summer. They had been transported from warmer climates, and Hannah knew they had to have been outrageously expensive. There was a harpist seated in an alcove playing classical music. Hannah thought that was a nice touch. Leave it to Judith Woodley to provide a touch of class from the moment they entered the door. "Your coat, ma'am?" A pretty maid, dressed in a dark green uniform and a frilly white apron, helped Hannah out of her coat. "Would you care to freshen up in the ladies' powder room?" "Yes, thank you," Hannah replied, and then she turned to Norman. "I'm just going to run a curry comb through my hair." Norman chuckled at her reference to the tool that was used to groom horses. "I like your hair, Hannah." "Ma'am?" The maid touched Hannah's arm. "If you'll just follow me, please." Hannah made arrangements to meet Norman at the bar and went off with the maid. She was an attractive brunette that Hannah didn't recognize, though she thought she'd seen her at last year's party. The Woodleys always hired outside help for their parties. Judith complained that the local girls simply weren't capable of being trained for such a special event. Hannah turned to the maid and asked, "You're not from Lake Eden, are you?" "Minneapolis, ma'am. I work for Parties Plus, the service that Mrs. Woodley uses." "That's a long way to drive for one party," Hannah commented, giving her a friendly smile. "Oh, that's no problem, miss. Mrs. Woodley arranges for our transportation, and this one party I wouldn't want to miss. I've been here for 3 years in a row now." "I thought I recognized you from last year. What makes this party better than other parties?" "It's a 5-day assignment, and we have the use of the indoor pool and spa. Mrs. Woodley even caters our meals while we're here. It's almost like a party for us." Hannah was fishing, but she never knew when information like this might come in handy. "I guess your regular assignments aren't this nice?" "No way. Usually we're in and out in less than 6 hours, and we work like dogs while we're there. Mrs. Woodley always allows plenty of time for us to set up." Hannah was curious. "How long have you been here?" "Since Tuesday morning. We spent 2 days cleaning, and yesterday we set up the tables and made sure that all the glassware and dishes were ready. Today we just helped the caterer." "When do you go back?" "Right after we do the cleanup tomorrow morning. We're usually on the road by noon. I'll be back home by 2 at the latest, but Mrs. Woodley pays us for the whole day." They had arrived at the ladies' powder room, and Hannah went in to take stock of the damage. Her hair looked all right, and she just patted down a few loose curls. Then she refreshed the lipstick that Luann Hanks had decided was just perfect for her, and went back out to find Norman. Norman was standing by the bar, almost lost in a sea of taller faces. As Hannah moved toward him, she was glad her heels were only 3 inches high. "Hi, Norman, I'm back." And just in time, Norman took her arm and moved her away from the crowd. "Our mothers are headed this way. Let's go over and pay our respects to the Woodleys." The reception line wasn't long, and Hannah and Norman took their places at the end. As they approached their host and hostess, Hannah admired Judith Woodley's dress. It was made of lilac silk, and the bodice was beaded with tiny pearls. Her light brown hair was caught up in an elaborate twist on the top of her head, and she looked lovely, as usual. She was smiling and chattering with her guests, and she appeared quite animated. Dell, on the other hand, looked surprisingly glum, and Hannah noticed that there were dark circles under his eyes. "Hannah," Judith extended her hand. "How lovely to see you." Hannah had the insane urge to reply that it was lovely to be seen, but she thought better of it. She searched her mind for something appropriate to say and pulled out a standard compliment. "You look lovely tonight, Judith. I had no idea that Claire had such wonderful dresses in her shop." "Claire!" Judith's green eyes widened, and Hannah knew she'd just stuck her foot in the mud. "This isn't from Beaumont, Hannah. Billy designed it especially for me." "Billy?" "Billy Blaze. He's a close personal friend of mine, and I see that you have a date this year." "How nice." Hannah cringed and introduced Norman to the Woodleys, making sure to mention that Norman had arrived to take over his father's dental practice. They chatted with the Woodleys for another brief moment, and then they moved on. "Billy Blaze," Norman chuckled as he took Hannah's arm. "I wonder if he calls her Judy." Hannah laughed appreciatively. This party might be fun if Norman kept making jokes. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and they wandered through the crowd for a few minutes, hailing the people that they knew. Then they walked over to view the appetizer table. "Caviar!" Norman pointed to the black tapioca-looking substance in a large cut glass bowl that was nestled in a larger bowl of shaved ice. "It's beluga," Hannah informed him. "I asked last year, and the waiter told me that the Woodleys wouldn't serve anything else." Norman was obviously impressed because he accepted a caviar-laden toast point from the waiter and smiled in anticipation as he raised it to his mouth. Then he looked over at Hannah and froze. "I'm sorry, Hannah. I should have asked. Would you care for some caviar?" "No thanks. I know that beluga is the best that money can buy. But I grew up right next to a lake. It's still just fish eggs to me."